had us, and my people still study it. Rontovik looked at the tribunal and he could see confusion on some faces, and anger on others, and he understood both reactions, because he had felt both in that moment. I did not know what to say to her, and this was the woman who had shattered my fleet and killed thousands of soldiers under my command, and she was standing in front of me, offering me a drink, and complimenting my tactics, and I did not have a framework for processing that. I took the glass, because I did not know what else to do, and I asked her why she would say that, and why she would study the tactics of a defeated enemy. And she looked at me with an expression I will never forget, because it was completely sincere, and there was no mockery in it, and no pity, and no superiority. She said, because that is how we got here, and we learn from everyone, especially the ones who almost beat us. He let the words settle over the chamber like dust after an explosion. In that moment, I understood what humanity is, and I have spent 11 years alone on a dead colony world trying to find a way to explain it. And I do not know if I can, but I will try. He stepped forward, and his voice carried now not with volume, but with absolute conviction. Humans are not the strongest species in this galaxy, and they are not the smartest, and they are not the most technologically advanced, and they are not the most numerous, and by every objective measure that the Concord uses to evaluate a civilization, they are unremarkable. But they have one quality that no other species I have ever encountered possesses. They are unfinished. The word landed like a stone in water and rippled outward. Every species in this Concord reached what it considered its optimal form centuries or millennia ago. And once that form was reached, we stopped. And the Velhari perfected their strength, and the Selkari perfected their intellect, and the Dreth perfected their endurance, and we built civilizations around those perfected qualities, and we have maintained them ever since. Humans have no concept of a perfected form, and they do not believe such a thing exists. And when you talk to them about optimization, they nod and they agree. And then they go back to doing what they have always done, which is to argue and experiment and fail and learn and change. They do not optimize, and they iterate. Every war they fight changes them, and every defeat teaches them something, and every victory teaches them something different. And every generation of humans is not quite the same as the one before, and they do not see this as instability or weakness, and they see it as their natural state. The humans who fought us in the first war would not recognize the humans who fought us in the third war, and the humans who fight us in the next war will be different again, and the ones after that will be different still, and this process does not stop, and it has never stopped, and I do not believe it will ever stop. A species that is always changing will eventually surpass any species that has stopped. And we have stopped, and all 12 of us have stopped, and we stopped so long ago that most of us do not even remember what it felt like to be in motion. He looked at each member of the tribunal one final time. You asked me why humans always win, and the truth is that they do not always win, and they lose battles, and they lose campaigns, and they lose entire generations to catastrophe and suffering. But they never lose the same way twice. And that relentless, infuriating refusal to stay broken is something that no fleet and no weapon and no strategy in this Concord can answer. He straightened, and for a moment he looked like the general he had once been, tall and unbroken, despite the missing arm and the gray scales and the weight of everything he carried. The silence is over, and now you must decide what to do with the truth. He turned and walked out of the chamber, and no one stopped him, and no one spoke. 7 months passed. The tribunal's findings were classified at the highest level available, and distributed to exactly 12 individuals, one from each species. Then the files were sealed, and the chamber was locked, and the bioluminescent fungi continued to pulse on its walls in the dark, for no one. Nothing changed. The political will to fundamentally restructure 12 species approach to warfare did not exist and could not exist because the restructuring that Rantovic described would require each species to abandon the very qualities that define them. And no civilization had ever done that voluntarily, and none of them would be the first. Rantovic returned to his colony world and sat in his small house on the edge of a dry plain and watched the sky turn colors that no one had bothered to name because no one else lived there. One evening, his communication terminal lit up with an encrypted message, and the encryption was military grade, and the sender was anonymous, and the message contained a single data packet. He opened it. It was an intelligence report, and it showed that humanity had begun establishing a network of deep space research stations beyond the outer rim, in regions that no species had claimed and no species had explored. And the stations were not military installations, and they carried no weapons. Their purpose, according to the analysts who had written the report, was unknown. But Rantovic knew. They were not preparing for war. They were not building defenses. They were not planning an invasion. They were expanding, again. They were doing what they had always done, and what they would always do, and what no force in the galaxy had ever been able to stop them from doing. They were becoming something new. Rantovic sat in his chair and held the datapad in his one remaining hand, and he read the report twice, and then he set it down, and he leaned back and he looked up at the ceiling of his small house on his empty world. And for the first time in 11 years, he laughed. It was not a bitter laugh, and it was not a defeated laugh. It was the laugh of a soldier who had finally made peace with the fact that he had lost to something extraordinary. Outside, the wind moved across the dry plain, and the unnamed colors shifted in the sky, and somewhere out beyond the outer rim, beyond the edge of everything the Concord had ever known, humanity was reaching for something that did not yet have a name. And whatever it was, they would find it. They always did. The first to speak after Rantovic's words was Fleet Primus Zelkon of the Selkari, and his voice came out in the clicking staccato rhythm of his species, and it carried the cold precision that the insectoid strategists were known for, across every world in the Concord. If humans are as formidable as you describe, then I have a question that your testimony has not yet addressed. Rantovic looked at him and waited. They have won or stalemated 3 wars against a coalition of 12 spacefaring civilizations, and they have done so with inferior technology and inferior numbers. And if your analysis is correct, they possess a fundamental military advantage that we cannot replicate. The Selkari's compound eyes caught the bioluminescent light and fractured it into 100 tiny reflections. So why have they not conquered us entirely, and why did they stop? Rantovic nodded slowly, because he had been waiting for this question, and because the answer was, the part that would break them. That, he said, is the part you will refuse to believe. He reached into his uniform and produced a small data crystal and placed it on the testimony pedestal, where it glowed faintly amber. And he said that the crystal contained intelligence gathered over 3 decades from intercepted human communications and cultural analysis and interviews with prisoners of war, and information obtained through covert observation of human military academies and political institutions. Before I show you what is on this crystal, I need to explain something about the way every species in this Concord fights. He turned to face the full chamber. The Valhari, my own people, developed a war doctrine based on overwhelming force applied at decisive points. And every Valhari officer learns this doctrine from birth. And every Valhari fleet operates according to its principles. And it has served us for 6,000 years. Based on predictive modeling and probability calculation. And their fleets move like mathematics. And their strategies are elegant and precise. And their doctrine has served them for 4,000 years. The Dreth use attrition, and they are patient and relentless, and they grind their enemies down over time, and their doctrine has served them for 3,000 years. He looked around the chamber. Every species in this Concord has one doctrine and one approach to war, And this is natural, and it makes sense, because a species evolves one dominant way of thinking, and its military philosophy flows from that way of thinking, like water flowing downhill. He picked up the data crystal and held it up to the light. Humans have no single doctrine. The chamber shifted and murmured, and Rantovik raised his hand. I do not mean they have no military organization, and I do not mean they are chaotic or undisciplined, because they are neither. When you look at the entire human species, their approach to warfare is not unified, and it has never been unified. They have hundreds of competing military philosophies, and they argue about them constantly. He activated the data crystal, and projections filled the air above the pedestal, showing fragments of human military texts and academy recordings and debate transcripts. They have officers who study wars from thousands of years ago on their homeworld, and who apply lessons from those ancient conflicts to space combat. And a human admiral once told me that she won a fleet engagement using a tactic developed by a human naval commander who lived 300 years before humans even discovered electricity. They have strategists who disagree with each other so fundamentally that they can barely cooperate. And they publish papers attacking each other's theories. And they hold conferences where they argue for days about whether a battle fought on an ocean 1,000 years ago can teach us anything about space combat. Years ago has any relevance to a fight happening in orbit today? And the answer is that sometimes it does. He turned to the Selkari delegation. Your tactical hive synth is the most sophisticated strategic computation system ever built, and it can model the behavior of any military force in the galaxy with terrifying accuracy. And it fails against humans because it is trying to model one opponent. He let that land. It is not facing one opponent, and it is facing thousands. And every human commander is a unique tactical entity shaped by a different combination of history and culture and personality and training and emotion and the particular books they read and the particular teachers they had and the particular mistakes they made earlier in their careers. No two human commanders fight the same way, and the hive synth cannot account for that, because the hive synth was built by a species that thinks in consensus. The Selkari fleet primus had gone very still, and his clicking had stopped entirely. Rantovik moved to the final piece of evidence, and this was the one that still woke him up at night. The third war and the battle that cost me my arm and my fleet, and the battle that ended the war. The Battle of the Viridian Corridor. He pulled up a tactical display showing the Concorde formation that had held the corridor, and the 3 human fleets that had converged on it. Fleet 1 attacked us conventionally with a direct frontal assault, and our formation held because it was designed to hold against exactly that kind of attack. Fleet 2 came from the flank and used something the humans call crossing the T, which is a naval tactic from their homeworld's oceans that involves positioning your force perpendicular to the enemy line, so that all your weapons can fire, while only a fraction of the enemy's weapons can respond. And this tactic is over 500 years old, and it should not work in 3-dimensional space combat. But they found a way to make it work. Fleet 3 did something that no one had ever seen before. His voice grew quiet. They flew their ships through our formation at maximum speed in a single pass, and they fired in every direction as they went. And they accepted catastrophic casualties, and nearly 40% of Fleet 3 was destroyed in that pass. But the ones that survived came out the other side, and turned and hit us from behind, while Fleet 1 held our front, and Fleet 2 raked our flank. All 3 tactics were different, and all 3 were applied simultaneously, and our coordinated response assumed that all 3 fleets would behave in a similar fashion, because that is what the hive synth predicted. And the hive synth was wrong. We lost 1,200 ships in 9 hours. The number echoed in the chamber like a funeral bell. 1,200 ships and tens of thousands of lives because we could not process the idea that 3 human commanders, facing the same enemy at the same time, would each choose a completely different way to fight. He deactivated the display, and the tactical projections faded, and the chamber was dim again, with only the slow pulse of the fungi on the walls. This is my third point, and it is the most important. The Concord's greatest strength is unity, and 12 species with one consensus and one optimized strategy and one coordinated response. And that strength has conquered star systems and ended wars and built an empire that has lasted 9,000 years. And it is also our fatal weakness, because unity means predictability, and predictability means that a sufficiently creative enemy can model your response before you make it, and humans are sufficiently creative. They do not field one strategy in a war, and they field 1,000 strategies, and they let natural selection decide which ones survive, discard, and the ones that succeed, they spread to every fleet, and every commander, and every ship within weeks. They evolve during the war itself, and they evolve faster than any species the Concorde has ever encountered. Fleet Primus Zelkan spoke again, and his voice was very quiet. You are saying we cannot beat them. Rantovik met his compound eyes. I am saying we cannot beat them the way we are. He paused, and becoming something that could beat them would require us to become something that we are not. The Second Terran Expansion War began 12 years after the first ceasefire, and the Concorde had spent every one of those years preparing. New ship classes had been built with heavier armor and redundant engine systems designed to survive the kind of improvised attacks that had crippled the fleet before. And the tactical hive synth had been upgraded with a new module specifically created to model what the Selkarai Intelligence Division called irrational adaptive threat actors, and the 12 species of the Concorde had contributed their finest officers to a joint command structure that was supposed to be faster and more flexible than anything that had come before. Rantovik had been promoted to senior fleet general and given command of the Concorde's 3rd Assault Group. He had spent the years between wars studying every piece of intelligence on human military behavior that he could access, and he believed that he understood them better than any other officer. Fleet. He was wrong. The engagement that broke me, he told the tribunal, took place at a station called Caldera, in a system so poor in resources that it did not even have a proper name on our star charts. Caldera Station was a human forward operating base, and it was small and old, and its weapons systems were a generation behind, and it held approximately 8,000 human soldiers and had supplies for perhaps 2 weeks, and it sat in a system that had no strategic value whatsoever. Caldera Station was a human forward operating base, and it was small and old, and its weapons systems were a generation behind, and it held approximately 8,000 human soldiers and had supplies for perhaps 2 weeks, and it sat in a system that had no strategic value whatsoever. The humans refused, and the tribunal chamber had grown very quiet, and Rantovik could see that several of the admirals had stopped looking at him, and were instead staring at the floor, or the walls, or their own hands, because they already knew what he was going to say, and they did not want to hear it again. In the first week, they disassembled non-essential station modules and used the materials to build gun emplacements in locations that our targeting systems were not calibrated to track, and they welded hull plating into blast shields, and they turned maintenance corridors into kill zones. In the second week, they vented atmosphere in entire sections of the station deliberately and on purpose, and they created zones that only humans in pressure suits could operate in, and our ground forces could not follow, because the Velhari cannot survive in hard vacuum for more than a few minutes, and neither can the Dreth or the Yulani. In the third week, they began sending out single-pilot shuttles on what our analysts classified as suicide runs, and we destroyed most of them, but the ones we destroyed were empty, and the ones that were not empty carried improvised explosive devices that did little damage to our ships, but forced us to reposition and waste point defense ammunition. And every time we repositioned, they used the gap to slit supply drones through our blockade." He paused, and there was something in his expression that might have been wonder. "And they played music." The Morthane ambassador tilted her translucent head. "They broadcast music on open communication channels during firefights, and it was loud and chaotic. And our communications officers did not know what to do with it, and some of them thought it was a coded signal, and spent weeks trying to decrypt it, and it was not a coded signal. It was just music. They played it because it made them fight harder." Rantovic let that hang in the air for a moment, and then he moved on to the part of the story he had never told anyone. "During the 4th month of the siege, I captured a human officer, and her name was Commander Lena Vasek, and she was brought to my flagship for interrogation. And she was injured and exhausted, and she had not slept in what I later learned was over 60 hours. And she sat in the interrogation room, and she looked at me with eyes that should have been defeated and were not. He could still see her face, and it had lived in his memory for decades, like a photograph that would not fade. I asked her why they did not surrender, and I explained that the station had no strategic value, and that reinforcements were not coming, and that she would save 8,000 lives if she simply agreed to lay down arms. And I told her that I respected her courage, but that courage without purpose was just waste. He stopped, and the chamber waited. She smiled at me, and she said, "Because every hour you spend here is an hour you are not spending somewhere that matters. And you still have not figured out that this station was never the point." That Rantovic could hear the bioluminescent fungi pulsing on the walls. I did not understand what she meant until 3 months later, when the siege was finally over, and I received a priority intelligence briefing that informed me that during the 7 months we had committed 200 warships to crushing one worthless station in a worthless system. The human military had launched a massive flanking offensive through a corridor of deep space that we had left unguarded, specifically because we had pulled ships from that sector to reinforcing the siege. They took 11 systems in that offensive. 11. He looked at the tribunal, and he could see the understanding forming on their faces, like cracks spreading through ice. Caldera was bait, and 8,000 humans volunteered to be the bait, and they held for 7 months, knowing that no one was coming to save them, because their job was not to survive, and their job was not to win, and their job was to make us look in the wrong direction long enough for the real attack to land. And it worked. Rantovic stepped forward, and his voice hardened. "This is what I need you to understand, and this is the thing that the Hive Synth cannot compute, and this is the reason I asked the non-military personnel to leave. Humans do not think about war the way we do, and they do not think about war the way any species in this Concord does. Every one of our 12 species treats war as a problem to be solved, and we look for the optimal strategy, and we execute it, and we achieve victory. And that approach has worked against every enemy we have ever faced, because every enemy we have ever faced thinks the same way. Humans do not try to solve the war you are fighting, and they try to change which war is being fought. They do not ask, how do we win this battle? And instead they ask, how do we make the enemy fight the wrong battle? They make decisions that look irrational, because the decisions are irrational, and that is the point. Because when you force your enemy onto ground that neither side has seen before, the side with the better plan loses its advantage, and the side that adapts faster gains one. He had a name for it, and he had carried the name in his head for 20 years. I call it the doctrine of broken logic, and it is the single most dangerous military philosophy I have ever encountered, because it cannot be countered by superior planning, and it cannot be predicted by superior intelligence, and it cannot be overwhelmed by superior numbers, because the moment you think you understand what a human commander is doing, that commander has already changed what they are doing. He stopped and looked at the tribunal, and he could see that some of them were angry and some of them were frightened, and the Selkari delegation had gone perfectly still again. "You want to know why we lose?" His voice dropped low. "Every battle plan we have ever written assumes that the enemy wants to survive, and humans want to survive too. But they want to win slightly more. And that difference, as small as it sounds, is an abyss that none of us have ever found a way to cross." Rantovik began with the First War because that was where the lie had started. 40 years ago, he said, I was a mid-ranking fleet commander assigned to what High Command called Operation Swift Lesson, and the name itself should tell you everything about how seriously we took them. He let that sit for a moment and watched the tribunal shift in their seats. Humanity had colonized 3 systems in Concord-claimed space, and the directive was simple: push them back behind the Orion line and demonstrate that further expansion would not be tolerated. And we were told it would take 8 days. He almost laughed, but the sound that came out was closer to a cough. 8 days. The Concorde had deployed 4,000 warships against Earth's 600, and the numbers were so lopsided that some fleet commanders had treated the deployment as a training exercise, and junior officers had volunteered for the campaign specifically because they wanted easy combat. Experience for their service records, and the tactical hive synth had run 9,000 simulations, and in every single one, the human defense fleet was destroyed within the first week. On day 1, the Concorde's vanguard crossed the Orion line and met the human outer fleet near a system called Kepler's Ring, and the battle lasted 11 hours, and it was exactly what the hive synth had predicted. The human fleet was outgunned and outmaneuvered and outmatched in every measurable way, and by the time it was over, more than 300 human ships had been destroyed or disabled, and the Concorde had lost 14 out of 4,000. On day 2, the remaining human ships pulled back toward their inner colonies, and the Concorde pursued at full speed, and the mood across the fleet was something close to boredom, and Rantovik remembered sitting in his command chair, reading reports, and thinking that he would be home within the week. Changed. The surviving human ships did not retreat to regroup, Rantovik told the tribunal, and his voice had grown quieter, as if he were telling a ghost story. They did not fall back to a defensive line, and they did not consolidate their remaining forces around their colonies, and they did not do any of the things that the hive synth predicted they would do. He looked at the Selkari delegation. They broke apart. The remaining human fleet shattered into hundreds of independent groups of 2 to 5 ships each, and they scattered in every direction like seeds thrown into the wind. Within hours, there was no central human command structure left, and no unified fleet, and no coordinated defense. The Concorde's admirals celebrated. The hive synth classified the human military as functionally dissolved, and recommended a simple mop-up operation to hunt down the fragments. That was the first mistake. Within days, the fragments began to attack. They did not attack the way any military force in the Concorde's history had ever attacked. One group of 3 human destroyers led a Concorde patrol squadron into a nebula that the humans had seeded with jury-rigged fusion cores pulled from their own backup reactors. And when the Concorde ships entered the nebula, the cores detonated, and the blast tore through 7 warships in seconds. And the 3 human destroyers were already gone before the light from the explosion reached the nearest sensor array. Another group captured a civilian cargo freighter and packed it with asteroid debris, and accelerated it to a significant fraction of light speed, and aimed it directly at a Concorde dreadnought's engine array, and the dreadnought's point defense systems were designed to intercept missiles and energy weapons, not 1,000,000 tons of rock moving at relativistic velocity, and the impact sheared the entire rear third of the ship away. A crew of 40 aboard a crippled human destroyer boarded a Concorde carrier through a breached hull section, and they fought through the corridors for 19 hours straight, using weapons they had improvised from engineering tools and hull plating, and they held a single junction point that controlled access to the carrier's flight deck. And they held it long enough for another human wolf pack to arrive from outside the system and take the carrier intact. Rantovic paused and let the silence fill the chamber. "We lost that carrier," he said. "We lost a dreadnought, and we lost 7 warships in a nebula. And we lost dozens more in the weeks that followed to tactics that no one had ever seen before, and that the Hive Synth could not predict, because the Hive Synth works by modeling enemy behavior, and there was no single behavior to model." He turned to face the tribunal fully. "The Hive Synth's prediction accuracy against human tactics dropped to 15%, and I want you to understand what that number means. Against every other species we have ever fought, it runs at 94%. Against the Dreth, it runs at 97%. Against the Selkari themselves, it runs at 91%. But against humans, it was 15. The Selkari delegation did not move, but their antennae had gone completely still, which meant they had stopped running calculations entirely, and that was something Rantovic had never seen them do. "The war lasted 14 months, he said. "Not 8 days, but 14 months, and it ended in a negotiated ceasefire, which was the first time the Concord had failed to achieve total victory in over 2,000 years. And when it was over, I submitted a report to High Command, detailing what had happened and what it meant." He paused. "The report was classified and buried, and I was promoted and told not to speak of it again." A low sound moved through the chamber, and it might have been anger, or it might have been shame. Continued, and now his voice carried the weight of something he had been holding for 4 decades. "You want to understand humans, and so I will tell you the first thing I learned about them in that war." He held up his remaining hand and closed it into a fist. "The Concord fights wars through optimization, and we are magnificent at it, and our fleets are coordinated, and our strategies are refined, and our technology is superior, and on the first day of any conflict, we are the most dangerous force in the galaxy." He opened his fist slowly. "Humans fight wars through adaptation, and on the first day, they are weaker and slower and less organized and less equipped, and by every metric that matters, they are inferior." He let his hand drop to his side. "But wars are not decided on the first day, and the longer a war goes on, the more the humans learn, and the faster they change, and the more creative they become, and the more willing they are to do things that no rational species would consider, and by the 100th day they are not the same enemy you fought on the first day, and they never will be again." A voice interrupted him, and it belonged to Admiral Vreth, and it was tight with frustration. "So your testimony is that humans are merely stubborn?" Rantovic looked at his old colleague for a long moment, and something passed between them that was personal and painful and had nothing to do with the tribunal. "No," he said quietly, "stubbornness is what you call it when it fails." He turned back to face the full chamber. "I am trying to explain what happens when it does not." The chamber had been carved from the bones of a dead moon 10,000 years ago, and no one alive remembered who had done the carving. Bioluminescent fungi clung to the walls in streaks of pale blue and green, and their light moved slowly, like breathing, and the 12 seats of the Concord Tribunal rose in a half-circle at the center of the room, each one built to fit a different species, and each one occupied by a figure who had not spoken in nearly an hour. They were waiting. General Rantovic of the Velhari Dominion stood at the entrance to the chamber, and he did not move for a long time. He had once been the most decorated military commander in the 9,000-year history of the Concord of 12, and his name had been spoken in war academies across 800 worlds, and his strategies had been studied by every species capable of holding a weapon, and none of that mattered anymore. He was old now. His scales had lost their deep violet color, turned a faded gray, and the left sleeve of his uniform hung empty and pinned to his side, because his arm had been taken from him at the Battle of Proxima Threshold 11 years ago, and he had never requested a replacement because he said the absence reminded him of something important. And when others asked what that something was, he never answered. For 11 years he had lived on a barren colony world at the edge of Valhari space, and he had refused every summons and every request for interview and every demand for testimony, and he had not spoken publicly about the wars or about humanity or about anything at all. Until now. The tribunal had not asked this time. They had ordered a unanimous decree from all 12 ruling species of the Concord, had compelled him to appear, and that had never happened before in living memory. And the fact that it happened now told Rantovic everything he needed to know about how afraid they had become. He walked into the chamber slowly, and his boots echoed against the ancient stone. And every eye and lens and sensory organ in the room turned toward him. The presiding voice belonged to Ambassador Quellis of the Morthane Collective, and she was a tall, fluid creature with translucent skin through which her 3 hearts could be seen beating at slightly different rhythms. And she spoke with the careful, measured tone of someone who had practiced what she was about to say. General Rantovic, you have been summoned before this closed tribunal to provide testimony regarding the military conflicts between the Concord of 12 and the species known as humanity, and specifically to address a question that this body has been unable to answer through any other means. She paused, and her 3 hearts beat once in unison, which among the Morthane was a sign of deep unease. The question is this: why does the Concord keep losing? The chamber was silent. Rantovic looked at them one by. He saw Admiral Vreth of the Velhari, his own people, sitting rigid, with his jaw locked and his 4 eyes fixed forward, like a soldier waiting for an explosion he knew was coming. He saw the Selkari delegation, 3 insectoid figures whose compound eyes reflected the bioluminescent light in fractured patterns, and who were considered the finest strategic minds in the known galaxy, and who had designed a tactical hive synth that linked fleet commanders across light years in real-time consensus, and who had watched that system fail against humanity not once, but 3 times. He saw the Dreth representative, massive and stone-skinned and motionless, and the Yulani ambassador whose feathered crest lay flat against her skull, which meant she was either terrified or furious, and the others, each from a species that had ruled stars for centuries or millennia, and each sitting in this ancient room because a species that had barely left its homeworld 200 years ago had beaten them so badly that they could no longer pretend it was an accident. The Concord had 800 billion citizens across 12 species. Humanity had 40 billion. The Concord had faster-than-light drives that could cross a galaxy in weeks, and weapons that could crack a planet open like an egg, and warships the size of small moons, and an unbroken military tradition stretching back thousands of years. Humanity had been flying between stars for less than 2 centuries, and yet in 3 successive wars spanning 60 years, humanity had fought the Concord to a standstill or outright victory every single time. The first war was supposed to last 8 days, and it lasted 14 months, and ended in a ceasefire that the Concord had never needed before. The second war was supposed to reclaim lost territory, and instead it cost the Concord an entire fleet group, and ended with humanity holding more systems than they had started with. Supposed to be the final decisive campaign, and it had been the worst defeat in Concord history. And it had taken Rantovic's arm and his fleet, and something else that he had never been able to name. And now 12 species sat in a room carved from a dead moon and asked the one question they should have asked 60 years ago. Why? Rantovic reached the center of the chamber, and he stood in the circle of pale light, and he looked at Ambassador Quellis, and he said nothing for a very long time. Then he spoke, and his voice was quieter than anyone expected. You will not like what I have to say. No one responded, and most of you will refuse to believe it. Still nothing. He looked at the Selkari delegation directly, and he saw their antenna twitch, which meant they were already running predictive models on what he might say next. And he almost smiled, because that reflex was itself part of the answer. Losing. The words hung in the air like smoke. Admiral Vreth shifted in his seat and his jaw tightened further, and Rontovik knew that his old colleague wanted to interrupt and tell him to get to the point and deliver a clean tactical analysis with numbers and projections and recommendations that could be fed into the Hive synth and converted into a new war plan. That was what they all wanted. A solution, a fix, an optimization. Rontovik was not going to give them one. Before I continue, he said, I need this chamber sealed and all non-military personnel dismissed, and I need the recording systems turned off, and I need every person in this room to understand that what I am about to say is not a tactical briefing, and it is not a strategic proposal, and it is not a recommendation. He paused, and the fungi on the walls pulsed slowly, blue to green to blue.